principal investigator for the Storage Futures Study. I would like to start by thanking our team written here. We've had a really wonderful run for the last couple of years learning about storage and doing this research. I think that this team really deserves a lot of credit. And I'm happy to stand here on behalf of them today to share some of these thoughts with you. Next slide, please. So as I said, this has been a multi-year research project. We hatched this project probably 3 years ago at this point, before the pandemic, to explore the increasing role of energy storage in the electric grid through 2050. And I think that both we here at NREL and the US Department of Energy offices that supported it, including the Office of Strategic Analysis and the DOE-wide Energy Storage Grand Challenge team, really think that energy storage is a very exciting area of research, and a lot is changing rapidly in this field. Next slide. What are some of the questions that we set out to answer? And we'll see some of these answers roll out in some of these key learnings. But first, from a techno-economic perspective, cost and performance, how will these change over time as we go forward? Secondly, we have a big focus in this study on diurnal storage. So anywhere from a few hours of duration up to, say, 10 hours of duration in terms of energy storage on the grid or behind the meter. And next, what does the economic levels of deployment look like in the United States? So we were not forcing a solution or forcing a level of storage, but kind of letting the economics lead that forward. Factors that drive deployment. And then lastly, once you have all of this energy storage on the grid that we anticipate will be coming, what are the impacts on grid operations? So we will try to look at all of these different questions across the study. Next slide. So as a result, we got a lot of questions, we've got a lot of reports, and we've got them all up on the Storage Futures website. The first report was the 4 phases of storage deployment, which is really a thought piece looking at the primary drivers over the next few decades that would lead to greater levels of energy storage deployment. The next one, Model Inputs Data Report, is really focused on looking at the techno-economics of not just lithium-ion batteries, but also a broader range of technologies. And so that's the place to look if you're interested in seeing how we pulled together some data on everything from flywheels up to compressed air energy storage across a variety of technologies, and that information is in there. Third report, we used our REEDS model, or capacity expansion modeling capabilities, to look at a variety of scenarios, and you'll see some of those results in a second, primarily focused on what diurnal storage looks like under a variety of drivers out to 2050. Fourth, we used our DGen model to look at customer adoption. We did a lot of model development actually to pair PV plus distributed storage together. In the fifth report, we looked at trying to define long duration energy storage, which is a term that gets bandied about a lot, but needs a little more explanation of what that term means. Sixth, using a couple of grid operations tools, including Plexos, to look at the impacts of the operations of the grid on with a significant level of storage. And then lastly, the report that we're looking at or talking about today. Next slide. So before we get going on the key learnings, I wanted to just touch on some of the areas where we're still there's still quite a bit of uncertainty. And anytime there's a fast-moving sector of the energy economy, there's uncertainty, and this area is no different. So next slide. A couple of them are storage growth and compensation. So some of what we have done and what we have modeled is sort of the economic optimum, assuming the system is operating perfectly. And one of the questions is, will the actual markets across the US respond and reflect those same economics, both for the energy markets and for the capacity markets. And so we make some conclusions here about the value of capacity from energy storage and the value of energy. But if some of those values aren't compensated or compensated not quite correctly, you're going to get some distortions in the market. The second one is on technology evolution. We have focused a lot on lithium-ion batteries in this effort, and I think that there are a large number of other energy storage technologies that have significant R&D efforts. We are also part of the DOE long duration storage SHOT, which seeks to reduce the cost of long duration storage significantly over the next decade. And as a result, some of those technologies could potentially have some significant cost reductions and compete with lithium-ion batteries as well. Next slide, please. A few more caveats. We have a little bit of information about the presence of demand response, but flexible loads in particular wasn't an area that we did a lot of analysis around. And so understanding those better is going to be really key to understanding kind of the end level of energy storage that gets built. And secondly, on the value of distributed storage, there are a number of value streams emerging on the distributed side, and EVs with bidirectional charging could provide a lot of value of backup power for homes and businesses, and some of those emerging values are not captured quite yet. And then the last one, as we go to longer and longer durations and perhaps much higher levels of renewables on the grid, we could see significant deployments of long duration storage, and that could displace some of the diurnal storage that we've modeled. And then secondly, renewable fuels could be used to fill in some of these needs that and seasonal needs. And we need to see if that renewable fuel gets developed and shared across sectors. So we would want to have, for example, knowledge about how hydrogen ends up getting deployed into the industrial sector, and if there's significant hydrogen that could be used in the electric sector as well. So next slide. So with those caveats out of the way, we would like to turn to 8 key learnings. We have a lot of other important conclusions and thoughts in the various reports, but we pulled out these 8 key learnings as really important across all of these reports. Next slide. So key learning number 1, storage is poised for rapid growth. What you see here in the graphics on the left is our reference case storage capacity in gigawatts with varying durations of storage that get built out to 2050. And again, this is not a scenario that gets to 100% or gets close to that. The graphic on the right shows a range of scenario results, and we've highlighted the reference case, which is the green line in terms of storage capacity, and then the variance around battery costs, and the other dashed lines are really kind of covering a number of other scenarios, varying levels of other costs such as PV or natural gas, et cetera. And so that encompasses a range of scenarios that we looked at, and that's all available in more detail in the diurnal storage report. And what I wanted to highlight here is that as we go through time, 2 things. One is that even in the lowest level of storage capacity build out on the right, we still see a significant deployment of grid scale storage and up to potentially 3,000 gigawatt hours or beyond in some of the high end scenarios. And so I think the other thing on the left I'll highlight is that we start now with making rather shorter duration battery storage investments, or the model does, and then it moves to 4 hours and it builds a significant amount of that, but then eventually moves to 6 hours, 8 hours, and 10 hours as what's optimum for the grid. And so, so as we kind of pair off some of these narrower peaks with the short duration, we need to have longer and longer durations. And that theme will come up again in some of the other key learnings. Next slide, please. Key learning number 2, recent cost declines are projected to continue, with lithium-ion batteries continue to lead the market share for some time. And so I think I wanted to start with this graph, which is partly why this area of research is so exciting. Between the continued drop in PV costs and wind costs and battery pack costs over the last decade, roughly, we have seen a lot of opportunities present themselves that weren't here before. Next slide. And the results of our cost analysis are shown here, so that even though we've had significant cost reductions, we anticipate significant additional cost reductions over the next decade or longer as we move into the future. These two graphs actually show the same cost numbers, just with two different units. On the left side, we've got installed capital costs in dollars per kilowatt hour. And on the right-hand side, we've got dollars per kilowatt. And so as you can see, they continue to decline across all the durations. And what I would say too, in the graph on the right, in terms of dollars per kilowatt, if you're right now looking at saying, hey, for my grid situation, I need to add 100 megawatts of storage, and I maybe need to add, I want to do that for a 2-hour duration. Maybe I want 4 hours, right? So, but the difference between 2 hours and 4 hours is really significant. It's almost a doubling. Whereas out in 2050, that additional increment of cost to get to 4 hours is much lower. And so, so we might see some additional overbuilding in terms of duration as we get further into the future and costs of battery packs come down versus the rest of the fixed costs of the system. Next slide. So key learning number 3, the ability of storage to provide firm capacity is a primary driver for cost-effective deployment. So we were able to, in the modeling, to separate out the different value streams that storage received. So if it was able to get value for capacity or get value for time shifting, and then ancillary services, which we didn't show on here because that impacted deployment much less than these two characteristics. But what you can see here is that if storage just gets value for shifting time, which a lot of people think of as, hey, this is the reason we have storage, we're going to shift solar from the middle of the day to later in the evening, that deploys a certain amount of storage capacity optimally. But if you say, hey, this storage is getting firm capacity value, that deploys significantly more storage. So, so we're getting a lot of the value. 75% here in the notes is from capacity value as opposed to just time shifting value. Next slide. Key learning number 4. This graphic, it shows a lot of the flexibility options that enable the modern grid to absorb more renewables and also deal with flexible loads, et cetera. And you can see that historically at NREL, we have shown this graphic for many years and shown people, and worked with grid operators to try and evoke some of these. What we are saying here is that while electrochemical storage has been one of the more expensive flexibility options, the recent cost reductions and projected cost reductions make it much cheaper and therefore in line with some of these other flexibility options. And so, so what you're seeing is that it might make sense in some cases, economic sense, to deploy batteries into the grid to provide flexibility versus some of these other options. So that's a changing dynamic in what we are talking about and recommending. Next slide, please. Additionally, in the same area of flexibility, we looked at a couple of scenarios in which demand response is deployed. So we're assuming a level of demand response in a couple of these scenarios. And what you can see here is that when demand response is deployed, we build out less storage. And so demand response involves consumer behavior and a lot of other factors. And so we need to really understand that a lot better. But when we add that to some of these options, we do see that the amount of storage that gets deployed decreases and reduces the amount of storage that's needed. Next slide, please. So key learning number 5, storage and PV complement each other. And I think this is really one of the key takeaways. And we see this both in these kind of temporal results, and we see this in terms of the overall deployment of storage and PV. So in this graph on the left, which is kind of a version of the duck curve for California, as we start to deploy more and more PV into the system, the peak period that needs to be met shrinks. So you can see that with the 2 arrows. So at 0%, it's quite a few hours, and then it shrinks to just a handful of hours. And if you shrink those peaks and make them more narrow, you're more cost effectively able to meet them with battery storage. So you need a shorter duration of storage for the same amount of power to meet that peak. And so we see a lot of that coming in into play in this scenario. On the graph on the right, we're looking at national average deployments, and the top set of panels is from 2020 and the bottom set of panels is from 2030. And so one thing you can see is that the batteries in 2020 that are deployed moves between 2020 and 2030 in the spring there, for example, it moves when the batteries are being charged from the evening when load is lowest to the middle of the day, when you start to have that PV that would otherwise be curtailed charging the battery. The other thing that's happening, and you can see it in the summer peak here, is that in 2020, that peak is quite wide. By 2030, that peak has narrowed quite a bit in that second set of panels. And therefore, that's more cost effectively met by storage. And so there are a lot of really interesting complements between storage and PV. Next slide. Key learning number 6. Cost reductions and the value of backup power increase adoption of building level storage. So in this set of scenarios, it's a little bit different than what we were just talking about, which was at the grid scale. Here we're looking at behind the meter consumer adoption of PV plus battery storage. And I think that there's a couple of key takeaways. One, we did a lot of modeling development within our DGen model, which if you're interested in that kind of thing, we've got the report is great and really explains how that was developed. And at this point for this analysis, we've assumed a 2-hour duration battery, and we can assume a longer duration battery if needed. And in the upper right, what we have here is the economic potential. And let me just explain that to you, which is to say that the economic potential is all the systems in the country, or all the gigawatts of potential for which you have a positive project cost, basically, or a positive net present value in financial terms. So eventually the system pays for itself, and that's a pretty significant amount, up to 100 gigawatts or more of 2-hour storage in our base case, with a range that's significantly higher, up to 250 gigawatts. However, while it's a positive project on paper, the payback periods are quite long. And so when we put that into our modeling and incorporate consumer behavior on top of that, we get a more reduced level of actual modeled adoption levels. And so if you look at the chart on the bottom, that range of 80 up to 250 drops down to more like 7 to 40. And so that's the reason, is that the payback periods, while positive, are still quite long. And so that's using today's assumptions and assuming that the grid operates similarly and compensation is similar out into the future. The other thing I wanted to talk about was, and if you look at the graph on the lower part, we looked at the value of backup power. And I think there's a lot more here we can look at too, but we implemented, based on a series of surveys, the value of backup power combined with outage rates across the country. And as you can see, the level of adoption increases significantly if you incorporate the value of backup power. And then lastly, that top curve on the modeled adoption slide shows that if you have breakthrough cost PV and advanced cost batteries, so that's really low cost PV and low cost batteries, you get almost a step change in deployment. And so there's a nonlinear effect there. And some of those costs came through in one of our partner reports from the Solar Future study, looking at really advanced breakthrough cost PV. And so there are options here on the distributed side that could lead to really significant levels of deployment. And what we found is that obviously it's very cost sensitive and also sensitive to the value of backup power, which anecdotally we see increasing across the country as we move forward. Next slide. See, key learning number 7, storage durations will likely increase as deployment increases. So in the couple slides back, I was saying how PV sort of narrows those peaks in the evening across the country and allows for shorter duration storage to deploy. That's true, but as you chew away at those peaks, you start to get to longer and longer peaks, and then more lengthy time shifting needs to happen. And so what we can see in this graph is that as we deploy more and more storage capacity, the duration of the marginal unit, or the next storage that gets deployed, starts to really increase on here. And this is not all of our scenarios, because obviously we get up to 10 hours of storage in some cases, but this is really showing that eventually you get to longer and longer durations that are optimal to be deployed. And that's as we're shifting more and more of the power from daytime to evening, we can see that both in kind of what's being deployed as shown here, and also kind of in the temporal hour by hour sort of analysis coming out of the grid operations work. Next slide. So key learning number 8. Here we get to some kind of end of the line, looking at 100% clean energy systems. So some of these scenarios were not in our original diurnal report, but we have added and looked at for the summary report here. So these are 100% decarbonization scenarios where 94% of the demand is met by variable renewable energy plus hydropower and geothermal. And then 6% is met by technology, renewable fueled thermal sources such as combustion turbines with hydrogen or biofuels. And so that's a technology that sort of represents seasonal storage in our modeling structure. And the thermal sources, as you can see here, we've got two panels. One is on the left, we've got curtailment. And on the top part, and you see significant curtailment during the spring and somewhat in the fall. Meanwhile, you see these thermal systems being used primarily to help with the summer peak and then a little bit in the winter. And so you start to see these seasonal variations of when there is additional need for something like seasonal storage. Next slide, please. So key learning number 8 continued. In these cases shown here on the left, these are all 100% decarbonization scenarios with a few variations. So one is reference 100%, and there's a paper link that details all of these scenarios and these results. High electrification means that we're adding significantly to the electrifications on the demand side. Low renewable energy and battery costs, and then lastly, low demand. But in all of these cases, we see that at 100%, we've got a lot of solar, a lot of wind, some amount of other renewables, and then significant levels of diurnal storage, as we've been talking about throughout, so 2, 4, 6, 8, 10 hours of storage, and then seasonal storage on top of that. And in these scenarios, large amounts greater than 400 gigawatts of seasonal storage are deployed. And so it really demonstrates the economic optimum and the value of having a technology that can overcome the seasonal mismatch in the scenarios that we have here. Next slide, please. All right, quick, and we are through this relatively quickly, but my name is Nate Blair, and again, I'm happy to be presenting today on behalf of the entire Storage Futures team. And Jess dropped in the chat the links to the Storage Futures study broadly, and we will, at the end of this, be sharing the slides and the recording of this webinar as well. And at this point, I would like to open it up for some conversation, and maybe I'll ask Paul to come on. I see that the chat's been very active. If Paul, you have a question that we should be responding to verbally. I see that Paul has responded to a number. Go ahead, Paul.
Lots of interesting comments about the effect of pandemic and some of the recent cost increases in raw materials, such as the cost of lithium and other things. That the need to kind of update those cost assumptions. Yeah, I mean, that's just an important point that was made. I'm not sure there's really as much of a question there as just kind of a reminder that these cost assumptions were based on kind of pre-pandemic conditions, and as cost and performance data is updated, we'll start to reflect that. So I put in the chat a link to the annual technology baseline, which is a set of consistent data assumptions that we use here at NREL that's updated annually. So you can kind of see not only what we've assumed for previous studies, but what we're kind of assuming for our current studies, as well as kind of a more detailed breakdown, because there was a discussion of the issues around cost per unit energy versus capacity. The annual technology baseline also breaks that down as well. So just information there, and we can go to some of the other questions as well.
Thanks, Paul. And I would just add that I think that I have seen the what's coming in terms of PV and storage costs out of NREL, and those costs are anticipated to increase to reflect some of the recent changes in the marketplace. When we're going out to 2050, we tend to assume that things will go back to some of the normal drivers, but I've been saying that the pandemic was going to end soon since I think April of 2020. So we might be wrong there. Let's see if there's any other questions.
There's a question about seasonal energy storage that we can respond to really quickly. But
Sure.
The focus of this work was primarily on kind of diurnal storage. There was some work done on kind of seasonal storage technologies as well, but most of the scenarios we evaluated tended to not go all the way to like 100% decarbonization. And Nate can address some of the political factors behind some of the decisions that were made if he cares to. But that would kind of explain why we didn't spend a whole lot of time looking at kind of 100% decarbonization scenarios. But in terms of the seasonal storage technologies represented, NREL's right now representing those technologies is kind of a generic hydrogen-esque type of technology. So you're basically making a hydrogen or hydrogen-derived fuel, and then using that fuel in either a combustion turbine or a fuel cell with kind of standard heat rate performances for those technologies.
Yeah, and I'll just add that I think that, well, we have a lot of other conclusions. These are the 8 that we felt really strongly that we could stand behind. And I think the other thing I would say is that, and I think Paul would agree with me, is that as we go to 60%, 70%, 80% renewable energy, the storage conclusions that we have here for the diurnal storage, we feel really confident about. I think that as we go towards 100%, some of the storage technologies and some of the storage modeling is still in development, and some of the technologies are still in development. And so while we have presented some key learnings from that range, we're feeling really much more comfortable and confident about the kind of more near term below 100% range. And that's one of the reasons we wanted to focus on it, so to help people understand what's happening in the near term as we had above 50% renewables.
Nate, we've got a question about the long duration storage shot. Kind of just looking for some information about what the goals of the long duration energy storage Earth shot are.
Yeah,
so
that's great. That's an easy one to answer. The goals are straightforward. We are actually starting to think about some modeling on this front as well. But the goal of the storage shot is to reduce the levelized cost of storage, which is a metric I can try to explain here in a second, but reduce that 90% for long duration storage, so more than 10 hours of storage, below the 90% below what the levelized cost of storage is today for lithium ion batteries, and do all of that by 2030. So it's I would say it's an aggressive goal. And the levelized cost of storage not only takes into account the capital cost of the storage system, but also how many cycles you get per year or how often you're using the storage system. And so when we get into these seasonal questions and beyond the diurnal questions, you're potentially cycling the storage system a lot less per year, and that inherently raises the levelized cost of storage because your energy you're putting through the system goes down. So I think there's a number of effects there that all work together into that levelized cost of storage, including the round trip efficiency as well, which we didn't discuss here, but we do talk a little bit about in our model inputs report, round trip efficiencies for various storage technologies. I've got the chat open here. I don't see the, Oh, and then we got a question about substitution of lithium-ion battery storage systems with alternative battery chemistries. We did look at that a little bit, and I would point you to another national lab, Pacific Northwest National Lab, who's also done quite a bit of work, and we utilized a lot of their work on cost analysis of various battery technologies as well. And I think sodium ion is one of those, as is sodium sulfur. And then, but even within the lithium ion battery storage world, there are a lot of different chemistry options. NREL has a significant effort to look at research to remove cobalt from lithium ion batteries. And obviously a lot of people are moving to LFP, lithium iron phosphate chemistries as well. And I think one of the things we've learned recently is to, as we move forward in cost analysis, to try and separate out some of those, because some of those components will impact the overall cost. Having said that, I will say that the chemical elements of a total battery system cost end up being a relatively small component of it when you realize that to install a grid scale system, you've got all the balance of system, you've got the electric balance of system, the cost of permitting, project development, etc. So so the actual chemical components in terms of cost can be less than you might think. Paul, there's a question on key learnings 5 and 7 seem to contradict each other on the drivers for duration. Do you want to respond to that? Can you elaborate on how they fit together?
Yeah, so we absolutely have a contradiction. Essentially, really the value of energy storage is a peaking resource. It's that capacity element, right? So when we look at the value of energy storage and we look at all the different things that they can provide, this key issue is, okay, there's the energy arbitrage time shifting value, but when we really look at that, okay, that's nice, but what we really have to do is not just supplement the energy from a peaker resource, but actually physically replace that hardware. And the ability to replace that hardware really does depend on its capacity credit, and that in turn is dependent on how long peaks are. And so when we look at typical summer peaking systems, a lot of the ISO RTO regions around the country have identified 4 hours as the length of time needed to adjust that hot summer peak. It's that that peak that occurs between, say, 3 p.m. and 7 p.m., something like that. And if we look at what happens if we deploy more solar, it actually narrows that peak. It doesn't reduce the peak at 7 p.m. or 8 p.m., but it certainly reduces that peak at 1, 2 p.m. And so as you add more solar, it narrows the peak, making it possible for potentially using shorter duration storage. However, as you add more storage itself, it clips the peak. So you have these two contradictory impacts. As you add more storage, peaks get longer. As you add more PV, peaks get shorter. So that's why you have kind of this near-term transition or near-term phenomenon where as you add more solar, you're likely going to make it easier for something like a 4-hour battery. But then as you get to some point, you add more storage, you get to the point where the durations are 6, 8 hours, or even you shift to net winter peaking systems. So that's why you've got that kind of apparent contradiction, but you've got those two competing impacts of short duration caused by PV, long duration caused by storage itself.
And I would just add, I think those will vary around the country, right?
Absolutely.
So those shapes and who's narrowing and broadening the peaks will be different in different places in the country, depending on the.
Yeah, we're already seeing in California
climate.
where you're starting to saturate kind of those effects. I don't think you're there yet, but you're definitely heading in that direction. Nate, we also had a question about kind of net metering and things like that, and kind of our work on distributed resources. It was from Galen up at the top.
Okay. Well, let's go to that, but I think someone has raised their hand, so we'll okay, sorry. Hand is down.
Yeah.
That's fine.
So Galen's question, what about changes in retail rate structures, net energy metering rules, and emerging kind of aggregation models? How might those impact distributed storage adoption? It seems like some of those factors could swamp some of kind of the baseline assumptions or drivers that we've analyzed.
Yeah, no, that's a good question. And I think in this study, we have built the methodology and we have worked in the general direction, but there are many more scenarios that we could run with regards to distributed grid and greater levels of interaction and feedback between what gets built out on the transmission side and the impact on both the wholesale price and potentially the rates. And I think anyone who's studied utility rates realize that it's very difficult to predict where those are going to go. We have worked to take the outputs of our reads, transmission level capacity expansion model, wholesale prices, a product called Cambium, if you're familiar with that, and incorporate that back into the degen future prices and try to adjust the rate structures based on that. But there is quite a bit of uncertainty as we go towards 2050 about the attractiveness of the rate structure for deploying distributed storage or not. And that's obviously in combination with greater levels of perhaps outages and greater levels of backup power that are needed due to increased extreme weather events, et cetera. So there's a lot to go into there. And I think it is right to point out the uncertainties of all of that. Not to mention the thing that I mentioned, not to forget about the thing I mentioned at the beginning, which is significant levels of EV penetration could also lead to a reduction in distributed storage as well, if it's primarily being used for backup power options. And so you can, at least the EV manufacturers are talking about the ability to provide backup power to your house in several big commercials of late. And so I think that could, from a consumer behavior standpoint, minimize where and when some people at least are interested in buying backup power. Stationary things like the power wall that you hang on your wall versus, the 100 kilowatt hour battery they might have in their car. So, sorry, I could talk about distributed storage all day. Do we have another question here?
Well, we've got one more in distributed. What incentive does a customer have for installing battery storage compared to traditional diesel or gas generators for backup power?
That's a good question. And I think that one of the next things that we would love to do is to try to compare buying a backup diesel generator versus buying PV plus storage in the modeling itself. And so what we've done now is buying PV plus storage versus paying the electric bill. I think that we are also working in Puerto Rico, where a number of people there have also purchased backup generators as well. I think there's a question, there's a value stream in addition to noise and some other issues and the reliability of generators. There's a value stream in terms of sizing the PV and storage appropriately that you can maintain many days of critical loads with the combination of those two systems together versus constantly running the generator and using fuel. So there's a couple of issues there, but we have not looked at that in detail in this report or in this study. There's a question about electric school buses and how they could contribute back to the grid, and vehicle to grid impacts. And we have not explored that in this. There is a lot of work at NREL going on in terms of looking at that and looking at charging stations. We have a bunch of different modeling activities looking at deployment of charging stations optimally, and whether or not those will need batteries as well, particularly for fast charging systems. And I think the one thing that's really important to remember on vehicle to grid is the issue of the degradation of the battery. And so depending on what the payment to the vehicle owner is, they might find that it's not worth the accelerated depreciation of their battery to get that payment from the grid operator. And then conversely, on the grid operator side, the uncertainty of whether or not those vehicles will be there when they're needed are a couple of the questions. But again, I would defer to some of our colleagues, perhaps more in the vehicle space, to address some of those questions. So there's a couple of questions about sector coupling, and I think that I raised that as an ongoing level of uncertainty, particularly as we think about potentially using hydrogen to meet some of what would be a long duration storage need. So if hydrogen is being made for the industrial sector and for other sectors in the economy, it might be that there's adequate hydrogen at an appropriate cost to use with perhaps even existing combustion turbine capacity. And so that's the technology piece that Paul was talking about previously. And again, that's an area that that we need to continue to explore in terms of the technologies around long duration storage and frankly, energy sector wide decarbonization. And we're working towards being able to model all of that at once, which is, as you might assume, a daunting affair.
Got a question about pumped hydro that I can address really quickly in terms of our pumped storage modeling. So we do have a number of scenarios that oftentimes we don't show significant growth of pumped storage, and sometimes we do. I think the biggest problem with pumped storage right now is understanding the potential opportunities for growth at some of these places using technologies such as closed loop pumped hydro, where you're not kind of imposing on natural ecosystems. And I think there's a lot of promise there. The real question is understanding the actual potential deployment and cost. We just haven't built that much pumped storage in the last really 30 years now. And so I think we need to get a better understanding of how cheap they might get. We have done low cost pumped storage scenarios, and we do build quite a bit. We've had scenarios where we actually double or even more the existing pumped storage capacity, which again is the vast majority of the electricity storage in today's grid is pumped storage. So I'm a big fan of technology. I try not to let that bias me too much, because we do see cases where, as lithium-ion batteries and other batteries come down, we do see some cases where we don't really see new pump storage development. But in cases where you can deploy some of these less technologies that are a little bit less disruptive, if we can get the costs down, I think there would be an opportunity there. So that's a long-winded answer of saying I don't know, but I wouldn't rule out the technology, but it does have some challenges.
And just to add on that, there's a comment about key learning number 1 that doesn't show pumped storage deployment. And I think it's important to remember that scenario, the reference scenario, does not get anywhere close to 100% variable renewable energy. And so it's going to be, when you are at 80%, 90%, 100%, at those higher percentages where you start to see need for these longer duration storage systems. And so you won't see utilities out there asking for much more than 4 hours in the near term. And because we are not anywhere close to that on the US grid. I think we have time for 1 or 2 more questions. There is a comment about flow batteries, or 2 comments about flow batteries. And I would just add that I think we do talk a little bit about flow batteries amongst other storage technologies in the model inputs report, and NREL and others are doing work on flow batteries, and they do they are considered to be one of the technologies that could be present in this long duration, more than 10-hour area, and they have some possibilities. I don't know that we are the best people to ask about what the cost of them is at this point, but I do know that there are people at NREL that are looking more into that. And if those, again, if those come down in cost to the point where they're competitive or cheaper than lithium ion for diurnal storage, then that's what we would assume would be deployed. And so we have used the lithium ion battery cost projections for these scenarios. But again, if it's a different technology that that comes down in price and gets deployed, it will have that same amount of gigawatts and gigawatt hours as what we anticipate from the lithium ion battery space. See, are there any other questions that we can answer? I see Paul's answering some questions. Have you looked at the potential of gravity storage? Again, we would see gravity storage as typically a long duration storage option. And so that was less of a focus in this study than diurnal storage. And so it is talked about in our model inputs report. And generally, we are interested in gravity storage. We have 1 or 2 kind of collaborative storage efforts that I'm aware of at NREL, thinking about gravity storage, but I don't know anything more than the cost numbers that we have proposed. I think it's an emerging technology, and for all of these emerging storage technologies, it'll be a lot more fun to look at their costs once they've gotten 1 or 2 commercial sites going, and we can really dig into what that performance looks like. And I think we're just about out of time. Thank you guys for the great discussion. I think that Jess has just put here in the chat again the link to the Storage Futures study and to the report that I've been talking about today specifically. And then also we will be posting this webinar after the fact for anyone that couldn't make it today. And we look forward to continuing to do a lot of storage analysis over the next few years. And so our work here is not done. But thank you all. Appreciate it very much. And Jess, I think with that, we can kill the webinar.
Thank you, Nate.
Sure.